Hi guys, so for this section of the assignment, we were supposed to go over the 4 essential questions in our text. The first essential question is, how can I get to know my students and their needs? I think this is really important, and one way, I think the most efficient way to get to know your students and their needs is by starting right from the very beginning, at the beginning of the school year. I think one tool to do this would be using icebreakers or activities that first few weeks of class, not only for your students to get to know you and you to get to know your students, but so that they can get to know their peers as well. I think you can learn a lot about kids by seeing how they interact with one another and how they communicate and the things that bother them. So just by even paying attention to their little conversations, you can learn a lot about a child. I also think it's really important that you establish trust within those first few weeks of being together, because the more the student trusts you and trusts that you care about them genuinely, the more open they're going to be about their struggles and their strengths. I think it's really, really important that you know each of your students and their needs, because by having this knowledge, you can kind of mold your lessons and your assignments in a way that'll best teach each student based on their personal needs, and you can't really do that if you don't know what they need in the first place. So I think it's really important to know your students and know what they're needing from lessons, what they're needing from you, what they're needing from their classmates, and the way that they learn best and communicate best. The second question is, what is most important and enduring for my students to learn about this topic? I think this is kind of going to be a learning experience for me, because I think it can get difficult to pick apart a lesson and decide what's like the most important. But I can see why it's beneficial, because if you're trying to cram every bit of knowledge out of a textbook, kids aren't learning, they're reciting. So it's important to pick the biggest learning tools within the lesson, and then really drive those home and make sure kids have a good understanding of those important key concepts instead of memorizing every little thing that there is to know. So an example I could use for the future classroom I want, so ideally I want 4th graders. So in 4th grade, social studies, kiddos are learning about regions, like the regions of the country. So like the Northwest region, the Southwest region, the Southeast region, and the Midwest. And within this, like, instead of kind of pinpointing every town that's in each region, I would rather, like, my students know the similarities and differences of each region. Why were states put into regions? And can you point out the states on a map? So, like, those bigger things like that, I'd rather drive home than all the little things. So there's an example of that question. And I do think like I said, it's important for students to learn the more important things out of a unit than learn everything out of the unit, is kind of how I see it. Next question is, how can I ensure that each of my students learns effectively and as efficiently as possible? So obviously, like, your key kind of goal as an educator is for all your students to learn everything they can, the best they can, while they're in your classroom. And I think this really starts with knowing your students. Before, during, and after lessons, I think it's important that you're assessing them in multiple ways, not only using formative assessments, not only using summative assessments, but really using a plethora of different assessments that could be accommodated to each student, and kind of seeing how they're progressing there, so you know if they're actually learning, or if they're like learning slower, or if there's other ways that you can teach them that they'll learn best. I think it's important to also not, I think you have to be careful when assessing students and making sure that you are using different types of assessments, because just because a student doesn't take a summative or formative assessment in a great way doesn't mean they don't know. Some students don't just don't test well. So I think it's important that you're kind of assessing students in a multiple different ways. Some students learn or show knowledge best hands-on. Some students show knowledge best by speaking. Some students show their knowledge best by, exhibiting a skill or making a project or writing an essay or giving a speech. So I think it's important that you give each of your kids those outlets in order to complete assessments, and that all comes back to knowing your students and knowing the way they learn and the way that they are taught most efficiently. The next question is, how will I know whether my students have learned what matters most? So I think this also goes back to that same key of assessments, but not only using like assessments, but observing kind of, and making sure that you're splitting lessons up to little sections and like going back and questioning knowledge. The best way to know that your students are learning what they need to learn is by asking them questions about what they should have been learning. And I think it's important for students to self-reflect too and go back on each unit and kind of self-assess themselves. Self-assess how well they were able to pay attention. Self-assess how engaged they were in classroom discussion and things of that nature. And I think it's important for a teacher to go back and self-assess and kind of go back on what went well during the lesson, what went awful during the lesson, what you thought the students really understood and what you thought they really may not have understood. So I think that by assessing and self-assessing, you can ensure that students are learning what they need to learn and that you're teaching what you need to teach. That covers all 4 of our questions.